Hey there, guys. Welcome to another Holy Shared. I'm very pleased indeed. I am chuffed to bits to have you here with me today in the tiniest parish in Christendom to spend a little bit of time together, hopefully talking about some stuff that really matters. Now, last time in the shed, I talked about an experience which I had way back in the mists of time when I was 17, which actually became a hinge point in my entire life. It was when I attended a meeting in an upper room in a large Victorian house in Liverpool, very close actually to Mount Zion, otherwise known as Liverpool Football Club. And I ended up being what people at the time called baptized in the Holy Spirit or filled with the Spirit. Now, as I explained last time, I now look back on all of this and interpret it rather differently, quite differently. But I certainly don't deny the genuineness of what happened or the impact that it had in helping to make me who I am today. It led, in fact, to 20 years of involvement in something called the house church movement. At least a dozen of those years were spent as a national leader in that movement in the 1970s and 80s, when it really was, the burgeoning thing that was going on in this country in, the realm of the church. Now, in the terms of the day, in house church terms, I was an apostle, a church planter, someone who was leading a full-time team of some 15 people and responsible for around 60 new churches. It was both an exhilarating time, but also one of growing realization that this wasn't where I belonged, theologically or spiritually. I'd become involved with it all at a very early age, as I say, and reached dizzy heights before I'd really found out who I was or who I wanted to be. So the question is, how did I shift from this globe-trotting house church apostle to become, a Church of England vicar? It's a good question, which a number of you have been asking me, and I'm often asked it. So it'd be good just to address that a little bit more. Well, what I can say is it's been a journey, a process of evolution, which began with wide-eyed innocence, believing that, we were restoring the church to its New Testament roots and ministry, and then bit by bit finding that the whole thing unraveled in my consciousness. Basically, what I now see as my natural, critical, inquisitive mind began to emerge. And I just found far too many questions to be able to ignore. And so I should say this, by the way, it isn't easy going through a process like that whilst at the same time being in a position of prominence in that world, surrounded by people who didn't welcome questions, who were looking to me as a stronghold, a figurehead of the kind of beliefs that they held, which I was now deconstructing on an industrial scale. But there are just our times in life when you know that the only way to go is forwards. Whatever that means, wherever that leads, you just have to go forwards. So by around 1988, 1989, both Pat and I knew that we had to get out of it all. We had to move on. I mean, it felt like career suicide. We were financially secure. I had position, status, work to do, but just none of that mattered. There was no way back. Once you've kind of committed to a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world, it's very difficult, if possible at all, to go back on all that. Now, there were plenty of good times in those days, and the experience that I gained contributed hugely to who I am now and where I am now, as Pat often reminds me. I mean, when I'm tempted to feel, as I often am, that I wasted umpteen years in all of that world, she wisely tells me, you're only who you are now because of all of that, because of what you've been through, which is always true in all of our lives. But moving on did leave us somewhat in the dark as to where we did belong, where did we fit in? If anyone had told me back then that I was going to become an Anglican vicar, I probably would have said that you'd lost your marbles. So, yes, it is a perfectly understandable question for anyone to ask, to wonder how I got from house church apostle to a dog collar and a pretty frock. Which is why I've decided to spend a little time here in the Holy Shed explaining this improbable journey and how I have, and still am in many ways, processing the issues that it has thrown up along the way. After all, it isn't hard for you to detect that I'm not exactly the paragon of mainstream Anglicanism. So how have I processed these things? How have I learned to live with them? The immediate question that we faced at that time, back then, when we departed the house church movement, was what to do with our little ragtag bunch of immediate followers, including, at the time, our own kids, who were thoroughly disaffected with church. I remember when we first started meeting them, I asked what they would like to do, and it was a negative that they responded with. They said, not worship. Which, when elucidated, came out as, we don't want to sing silly songs. What they needed, as did lots of other people we discovered, was space to be real, to be honest, to ask lots of questions without getting a pile of pre-packed answers in response. So we began meeting at first in our living room, in an ironic twist of going back to our house church roots. But we quickly outgrew the living room, and we decided to try meeting in the upstairs room of a pub near Clapham Common. As a statement of self-deprecation, we called ourselves Holy Joes. There were lots of serious questions, but there was also an appealing lack of earnestness about it all. You could say there was, a certain amount of levity. There was a lot of banter in the midst of, as I say, some very serious questions, which did at times lead to tears, led to anger, led to the expression of lots of hurt that people had experienced in churches. There was a lot of emotional depth to it, but there was also this wonderful sense of fun and at times friendly banter thrown in. And so for the next 10 years, me and Pat sat in a pub every single Tuesday evening, hosting and holding a changing bunch. There were probably thousands of people over that 10 years, but never more than like 50 on a given night. And we found ourselves sitting there hosting this bunch of spiritual misfits and church dropouts, as they predominantly were, who were engaged in frank, no-holds-barred discussions, debate, sometimes actually out-and-out argument about God, about the church, about the world, and anything else that cropped up, really. Holy Joes gave me personally a different approach to leadership, shifting right away from something kind of directorial, if you like, into something that was much more about facilitating. It was about holding a space for people, but also resourcing the oft-times boisterous arguments and debate with some subtle but genuine theology. It was mostly a lot of fun. I say mostly because it wasn't always, but it was mostly a lot of fun. I was even interviewed, actually, for a pub trade magazine, which I'd never heard of. Why would I? A trade magazine called The Publican, who were fascinated that in a time of recession, we were bringing 40 or 50 people into a pub every week, each of whom was drinking, 2 or 3 drinks and sometimes purchasing food as well. By the way, I did say, our leader was quite friendly with you people, the publicans, and it was good. It was a good interview, and the early 1990s, when we really got going down this road, was a very formative period for me. not just leading Holy Joes, but also going through the process of clarifying my thoughts about a whole lot of things, digesting what I'd been through, what had been going on the inside of me through all of that, where I was now, and what I thought about a whole range of things. And all of this was aided in large part by the fact that at the time I was studying for a master's degree in biblical hermeneutics. In the summer of 1994, I wrote my first book, The Post-Evangelical, which was the result of pondering a shift that I saw occurring with many people away from an evangelical form of faith, in some instances away from faith altogether. And I wanted to shed some light on what I believed lay behind that shift, and to help people understand that there were other interpretations possible, that the church had other traditions, there were other paths, to open up really for people a bit more road to travel on. It was clear to me that the flourishing culture of postmodernity was eroding confidence in all the old certainties in society, including especially the realm of religion, and that if faith was to survive beyond the religious ghettos where faith so often ends up being trapped, it must engage positively with what was happening in the wider world, and it must evolve in quite radical ways. My intention was not at all to undermine anybody's faith, quite the reverse. I wanted to dare people to stretch their faith further, to allow their faith indeed to be reformed, reconfigured for and by a new age of social history. Well, the response to the post-evangelical went far beyond my expectations. Sacks full of mail came in within weeks. It was just before emails took off, so it was snail mail. And after a short time, I knew exactly what each of them was going to say. Basically, thank you. At last, someone has said this. It was as if I wasn't necessarily saying something absolutely brand new, so much as verbalizing and articulating something that was at some level or other buzzing around, underneath the surface. And, surprisingly, for that kind of religious book, The Post-Evangelical, it's still in print, nearly 30 years on. May have to have some celebrations next year, actually, 30 years on. And it's in fact now listed in the publisher's classics range. Bear that in mind, I'm a classic. Nearly all the invitations to talk about that book came from within the Church of England, surprisingly for me at the time. So I was speaking at bishops' clergy conferences, churches, vicar training schools, deanery events, all these kind of things, but mostly within the Church of England, all of which in a strange way fed into an underlying and growing attraction that I felt toward what's often called the comprehensiveness of the Church of England, its breadth of tradition. Having spent much of my life in the realm of so-called nonconformity, which I discovered was actually entrenched in its own kind of conformity, I liked the idea of a broad church, of making space for a wide spectrum of theological and ecclesiological positions, a place of fresh air. I was fed up with the kind of tightrope approach to Christianity, and felt much more appeal in the idea of a spacious road. I mean, ironically, during my nearly 30 years in the Church of England, 27 of them ordained, I have watched that breadth and generosity of approach narrow, dwindle, and diminish, swallowed up by mean-spiritedness, really, and sectarianism. My original allure by the idea of a church family respectful of both liberal and conservative expressions of faith and everything in between, is now frequently frustrated by the increasing reality of intolerance and narrow tribalism. I'll say more about that on another occasion as I take you down this journey. So when I met Bishop Richard Charters, which I asked if I could, the former Bishop of London, to explore whether there may be a place for me in the Church of England, he listened attentively to my story and he said, "We must meet again, Dave." A bit like that anyway. And when I did meet him again in 2 weeks' time, he knew everything about me. And he welcomed me with this caveat. He said, "Dave, you're going to find the Church of England very frustrating, and you'll be critical of many things. But I believe the church will benefit from your criticism." What a wonderfully generous thing for someone to say. The Post-Evangelical had actually appeared in print that very week in the summer of 1995. And he told me that he'd read it and he would like to recommend it to all his evangelical clergy. Now, let's face it, me and Bishop Richard represent very different ecclesiastical stables, or places on the ecclesiastical spectrum. But I have benefited hugely from his generosity and breadth of heart and vision. Having worked for him for several years when I was first ordained as his chaplain for the environment, I've always felt supported and encouraged by him. I found in him a friend as well as a patron. And for me, he represents that broad church approach that I regret has rather diminished so much in recent years. When I was ordained, I never envisaged myself serving as a parish priest, in other words, being the vicar of a parish church. But when our home church, St Luke West Holloway, was suddenly faced with an interregnum, John Sentamu, who was our area bishop, he became, of course, the Archbishop of York, but at that time he was our area bishop, and he said to me, "My brother Dave," he said, "this is too obvious. You should be the vicar here at St Luke's." Well, me and Pat weren't entirely convinced. I knew that there'd be things that I would want to change, and the little congregation at the time were very much our friends. You don't always want to have those kind of negotiations with people who are friends. But after considering the whole thing, we decided absolutely we wanted to go ahead. And then followed 19 or so of the most happy and fruitful years of my life. And the people of St Luke's remain forever in my heart. Now, it's true, mine is an improbable journey. Many couldn't imagine me kneeling under the dome of St Paul's Cathedral being ordained. One of my former house church colleagues, a fellow apostle at the time, wrote saying that they were all puzzled by it, but he wished me well. Others, I have to say, were less generous. Some thought that I'd completely lost the plot. And there was this wonderful moment the week after, I think it was the week after my ordination, when the Church Times published a big double-page article contrasting on the one side a photograph of me on the steps of St Paul's in my frock, and Gerald Coates, another former house church apostle friend of mine, addressing a crowd at Wembley Arena. I mean, this is some of the story anyway of how it all happened for me. But of course, it's only a fraction of the real journey, much of which is more inward and more to do with my thinking as I adjusted to life as an ordained Anglican cleric, especially when I did become the vicar of St Luke's. I mean, how did I maintain my progressive outlook in an essentially conventional institution? How did I understand the meaning of ordination itself, of priesthood? You know, these are not words or ideas that were part of my own background and tradition. So how did I understand the meaning of priesthood? What did I do about the liturgy? How did I make sense of things like infant baptism? And what about dog collars and vestments and Eucharistic theology? I mean, let alone same-sex marriage. How did I process all of these things? How did I find a place of comfort in all of that? The other question I'm constantly asked is how I see the future of the Church of England. The future, indeed, of any conventional form of church in a world where the given models of church are diminishing by the year. Is something radically different required? And if so, what? Well, welcome, dear friends, to my improbable journey and the kind of questions that it raises, some of which I will comment on in future Holy Sheds. And I hope that you'll join me in thinking about these things. And do please send me any questions that you have about these things. I'd love to incorporate them. I know that quite a lot of people who come into the Holy Shed are themselves clergy, and maybe you're grappling with issues yourself. And if there are things you want to kind of throw at me about that, to know what my comment is, I'd be happy for you to do that. Certainly, as I do peer into the future, my most obvious observation is this, that staid traditionalism hasn't basically got a prayer. This is the part of the church which is fading most quickly, by the hour, you might say. This is the part of the church, as I say, which you find is the sort of historically the pillar of the church, and yet it is where there's such a huge descent in terms of numbers and viability. It's the religion of nostalgia, basically, closely linked to a wider social nostalgia for a bygone era that's gone and cannot be restored. And I think that it's that nostalgia in the general population which politicians play on a lot, given the impression that they can restore things, to that sense of equilibrium that people imagine existed in the past. The big question is, did it ever exist anyway? But anyway, regardless of its faults or virtues, the fact is that kind of staid traditionalism is part of the past, not the future. It's hopelessly out of touch with the instincts and impulses of a world that, in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, has come of age. And by that, Bonhoeffer did not mean that the world is all grown up and mature, far from it. He meant a world that no longer needs the crutch of religion, if you like. A world that no longer requires or desires the explanations of or the trappings of traditional religion. For centuries and centuries, society was shaped around that kind of religion. Bonhoeffer observed in the late 1940s, mid 1940s, that it was basically a done deal. It was gone, and that is so much more the case today. So it's in this sense, you might say, that the post-Enlightenment world is a world come of age, is disenchanted with religion, in the same way you could say that Dorothy and her companions were disenchanted by the curtain falling to reveal the real Wizard of Oz, that he was a frightened little man devoid of magical powers. Religion once held sway in society, but now the curtain has fallen. And this is true of swathes of the Church of England, but also of the Church in general. The alternative approach to the future for church is sectarianism, a religion of certainty, often fundamentalism, within a fortress mentality, over against the world, which is corrosive of old certainties. And in a deeply uncertain age, there is an appeal about this. There's an appeal to sectarianisms on critical sort of sense of assurance. But this, be assured, friends, however bright and glittery and happy-clappy it may appear, this has no hopeful way forward for our world. Only a more deeply divided world, when what we really need is to discover afresh a profound underlying commonality among people, a commonality, and indeed with all creation. Church as we know it probably doesn't have a long-term future. That's what all the statistics of church tell us anyway. All the graphs are going in one direction. It's either dying of old age or else it's retreating into a fortress certainty, focused more on being whisked away to heaven than restoring goodness to the world. But there is a future for the kingdom of God and the new communities that will open up as a result of that in people's lives. So this is just a little beginning to the journey, the unlikely journey which I'd like to talk about and the issues that it's thrown up. So join me again as we pursue this, and do send me any questions that this raises for you too. So we're going to have a prayer now, and because really, I think what we need to realize more and more is that not only is our God too small, our notion of church is too small. We're thinking about these little, at the end of the day, diminishing and sometimes very sectarian groups, when the real church is the entire cat and caboodle of the world and the universe. So, what a wonderful world. 8.7 million species of plants, bacteria, and animals, including me, and only 1.2 million so far named, most of them insects. Which means that millions of organisms remain your divine secret. You are the cosmic neophile, the celebrated lover of innovation and difference. Riotous variety is the name of your game. Deviation and aberration, your pleasure. What a contrast to the sad monolithic obsession with convention and orthodoxy which scars the church, where good people still find themselves excluded, bullied and barred, simply for being who they are, unique, different from a prescribed religious norm. 94 million light years is not enough to entertain you. In this galaxy alone, 100,000 million stars sing your praise, their creed, eternal twinkling. OMG. We may need to reconsider how to go about living together in this teeny weeny cloister of your true church, the universe. Amen. Okay, well, dear friends, if you have a drink handy, I'd like you to join me in a toast. I propose a toast to this wonderful world, a toast to a life that never stops evolving, which never stands still. Once things stand still, they're dead. Here's a toast to a life that keeps on going, a toast to a faith that constantly calls us beyond ourselves and beyond our limited vision of reality, a toast to the Church Universal, the Church of the Universe, to life, l'chaim. Well, thank you for being with me, guys. If you like what I'm doing here in the shed and you want to support us, you can buy us a coffee. You just need to follow the link here on the screen. It's also in the description on the YouTube videos of the Holy Shed. Thank you so much, dear friends, for many of you who support us like this and in other ways too. It's much appreciated. Only other thing I really want to say is that we have a soul space this week on Thursday evening, a reverie for Corpus Christi. Hey, love you to join me. It's no more than an hour. lovely music, videos, film clips, poetry, images, and some of me yakking on. It's 7 o'clock Thursday evening. Do join us if you can. And that is really just about it. I'm going to leave you with a blessing. And I just hope that you have a great week this week. Be kind to the world. Be kind to yourselves, dear friends. Stay human. And I'll see you soon. Bye.